Hey everyone, welcome back to Beast History. Let's do a little thought experiment. Picture this. It's Friday. It's 4:59 p.m. You're watching the clock on your screen, or maybe just feeling it in the air, in the subtle shift of energy around you. You can almost taste it. That final minute ticks away and then it happens. The moment of release. That glorious, sacred instant when the weekend officially begins. That feeling, that exhale, it's universal. It's a 2-day stretch of freedom that feels like a fundamental human right. A period of time that is yours and yours alone. But what if I told you it's not a right? Not really. What if I told you that your weekend is a trophy? That it's the spoils of a brutal 3,000-year war against an enemy that never sleeps. The tyranny of endless work. The story of the weekend isn't a gentle evolution. It's a story of revolution, of bitter theological feuds, bloody labor disputes, and one of the most brilliant, cynical business decisions in human history. It's the story of how humanity fought, bled, and schemed its way to having Saturday off. And to understand how we won it, we first have to travel back to a time before it even existed. A time when the very concept of a week was as alien as a smartphone, and rest was not a right, but a privilege granted only by darkness, weather, or sheer, bone-crushing exhaustion. Before we dive in, try to erase everything you know about time. Forget Mondays, forget birthdays, forget 9 to 5. For the vast, overwhelming majority of human existence, time wasn't something you could measure in neat, identical blocks. It wasn't a grid on a calendar. Time was a force of nature. It was the sun dragging itself across the sky, its position telling you when to hunt and when to seek shelter. It was the moon, waxing and waning, its ghostly light a silent clock for the deep rhythms of the world. Time was the ache in your back that told you the harvest was almost done, the gnawing hunger in your belly that screamed of winter's approach, the first tentative warmth on your skin that promised spring. Life for our earliest ancestors, and even for the first farmers, was a relentless cycle of tasks dictated not by a schedule, but by necessity. There was no quitting time. You worked until the task was finished or until the sun abandoned you to the dark. You rested when you were sick, or when a blizzard buried your world in snow, or when your body simply gave out. Rest was a surrender, not a plan. The idea that on a specific, recurring day you would simply stop, regardless of whether the grain needed to be reaped, the roof needed mending, or the hunt was on, would have seemed like madness. It wasn't just impractical, it was suicidal. Work was life. To stop working was to risk death. This was the state of the world for millennia, a world of ceaseless, necessary toil. Civilizations rose and fell on this principle. The great ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the timeless pyramids of Egypt, these weren't built by workers who clocked out for a 2-day break. They were monuments built on the foundation of human time as an infinite, exploitable resource. The life of a laborer, a farmer, a slave, was a river of effort, flowing from birth to death with few, if any, dams. And then, somewhere in the arid landscapes of the ancient Near East, a small, nomadic tribe came up with an idea so radical, so utterly counterintuitive, that it would change the world forever. It was an idea that would serve as the first shot in the long war for our time. This was, of course, the Hebrews, and their revolutionary weapon was a single, powerful concept, the Sabbath, Shabbat. To us, a day of rest seems nice, a pleasant custom, but to understand its earth-shattering importance, you have to see it through the eyes of the ancient world. The foundation of the Sabbath comes directly from the Hebrew creation story in the book of Genesis. God works for 6 days, creating light, land, animals, and man. And then on the 7th day he stops, he rests, and he blesses that day and makes it holy. Let's pause on that for a second. The all-powerful, omnipotent creator of the universe rests. The act of not working is given divine status. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not laziness. It's the holy culmination of creation itself. By commanding the Jewish people to observe the Sabbath, the law wasn't just giving them a day off. It was commanding them to imitate God. It was reframing rest from a human necessity into a sacred duty. It was the first time in history that a culture had enshrined, as a core tenet of its very existence, the idea that a person's value was not tied to their constant productivity. But the Sabbath was more than just a theological statement. It was a deeply political and social declaration of war. Remember the context. The foundational story of the Jewish people is the Exodus. It's the story of their escape from generations of slavery in Egypt. What is a slave? A slave is a person whose time is not their own. A slave is a human tool owned by a master to be used until they are broken. The Egypt of the pharaohs was the global superpower of its day, an empire of unimaginable wealth and power, all of it built by a workforce that did not stop. The crack of the overseer's whip was the metronome of the Egyptian economy. Now imagine telling a pharaoh, a self-proclaimed god king whose entire civilization was built on the principle of endless labor, that once every 7 days, your people were simply going to stop. Not because the weather was bad, not because the tools were broken, but because your God said so. This isn't just insubordination. It's a repudiation of the entire Egyptian worldview. Every single week, when the sun set on the 6th day and all work ceased for 24 hours, the Sabbath was a living, breathing declaration. We are not slaves. We have a master, but it is not you. Our time, our bodies, our lives belong to him, and he has commanded us to rest. It was a statement of freedom and human dignity, so profound it's hard for us to grasp. The commandment wasn't just for the wealthy, it was for everyone. The 4th commandment in the book of Exodus is stunningly specific. It says to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, but the 7th is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And then comes the critical part. On it you shall not do any work, you, or your son, or your daughter, your male servant, or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. This was unheard of. It wasn't just a day off for the man of the house. It was for his children. It was for his servants, his slaves. It was for the foreigner living among them. It was even for the animals. The ox was to be unyoked from the plow. The donkey was to be unburdened. For one day, the entire system of hierarchy and labor, the entire pyramid of production, was to be flattened. Everyone, from the richest patriarch to the humblest farm animal, was granted the divine right to stop. It was a weekly reset button for society, a constant reminder that freedom from toil was a universal gift. This idea was so bizarre, so alien to the surrounding cultures, that it became one of the defining and most mocked characteristics of the Jewish people. As they spread and eventually came into contact with the next great superpower of the ancient world, their strange custom would collide with an empire built on efficiency, conquest, and relentless pragmatism. That empire, of course, was Rome, and Rome thought the Sabbath was an absolute joke. To understand the Roman reaction to the Sabbath, you have to understand the Roman mind. The Romans were the architects and engineers of the ancient world. They valued discipline, order, and relentless forward momentum. Labor omnia vincit, work conquers all. This was the ethos that built the aqueducts, the roads, the Colosseum. It was the mindset that forged an empire stretching from the dreary shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia. They were, in a very real sense, the ancestors of the modern corporate mindset. Efficiency, expansion, and productivity were their gods. So when this disciplined, martial, work-obsessed culture encountered the Jews and their peculiar habit of shutting everything down for a full day every week, they reacted with a mixture of contempt, suspicion, and ridicule. To the Romans, it was self-evident proof of laziness. Why would any sane person voluntarily choose to be idle? It made no economic sense. Roman writers and historians, the great intellectuals of their day, were merciless. Seneca the Younger, the famous Stoic philosopher and tutor to the Emperor Nero, sneered at the custom, complaining that by observing their Sabbath, the Jews were wasting a 7th part of their life in idleness. Think about that phrasing. Not enjoying, not resting, but wasting. For a Roman Stoic, time was a precious, non-renewable resource to be used for self-improvement and civic duty. To deliberately let a full 1/7 of it slip away was an offense against reason itself. The historian Tacitus, one of our main sources for the history of the early empire, was even more dismissive. He speculated that the Jews adopted the 7-day rest because they had been expelled from Egypt after suffering from a terrible plague, and that they were simply commemorating the 7th day, when their long, miserable journey had finally ended. He saw it not as a holy day, but as a monument to their own exhaustion and weakness. He wrote that the attractions of indolence were what made the custom stick. Indolence, laziness. That's what the Roman elite saw when they looked at the Sabbath. And it wasn't just the intellectuals. The satirist Juvenal, who wrote scathing critiques of Roman society, mocked Jewish people for worshiping the clouds and for their slothful Sabbath. He saw it as part of a package of bizarre, antisocial behaviors that made them poor Roman citizens. The Roman world was one of public life, of business in the forum, of socializing at the public baths, of attending games and rituals. The Jewish practice of withdrawing from public and commercial life for a whole day seemed suspicious. What were they doing behind those closed doors? It was clannish. It was weird. It was, in a word, un-Roman. Imagine a Saturday in the city of Rome in the 1st century. The streets are a chaotic, vibrant symphony of commerce. Carts clatter over cobblestones. Merchants shout their prices from stalls packed with spices from the East and textiles from Gaul. Senators in their white togas are carried on litters, discussing politics and business deals. In the forum, lawyers are arguing cases, messengers are running dispatches, and the air is thick with the smell of street food and the constant hum of an empire at work. Now picture a small Jewish quarter within that same city, and as the sun begins to set on Friday, a strange quiet descends. The market stalls are covered. The workshops fall silent. The doors are closed. To a Roman walking by, it would have been eerie. It was a pocket of deliberate, willful nothingness in the heart of the world's busiest city. It wasn't just a different religion. It was a different theory of time itself, an open challenge to the Roman god of productivity. This weekly act of defiance, this stubborn insistence on a day of sacred rest, would continue for centuries. But soon, a new faith would emerge from within Judaism itself, one that would take this radical idea of a day off, rebrand it, and sell it to the entire Roman Empire. The world was about to get its first official day of rest, not from a Jewish prophet, but from the most powerful man on earth. The transition from a Jewish Saturday to a Christian Sunday is one of the most significant rebranding campaigns in history. And at the heart of it is one man, the Emperor Constantine. First, let's set the stage. By the early 4th century AD, the Roman Empire was in trouble. It was a sprawling, bloated, chaotic beast, plagued by decades of civil war, economic instability, and barbarian invasions. It was also undergoing a profound spiritual crisis. The old pagan gods of Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva were losing their grip on the hearts and minds of the populace. In their place, dozens of new mystery cults, many from the eastern provinces, were exploding in popularity. You had the cult of Isis from Egypt, the worship of Mithras, a favorite of the soldiers, and of course this strange, stubborn, and rapidly growing sect known as Christianity. The Christians were a problem for the empire. Like the Jews, they were exclusive. They refused to make the token sacrifice to the Roman gods and the emperor, which was seen as a test of civic loyalty. This refusal led to waves of brutal, sporadic persecutions. But persecution had only made them stronger. They had a sophisticated organizational structure with bishops and dioceses, a powerful message of salvation and equality, and a willingness to die for their faith that both horrified and impressed the Roman authorities. Enter Constantine. Constantine was not an emperor who inherited a stable throne. He was a warlord, a brilliant general who fought his way to the top through a series of bloody civil wars. He was a pragmatist, a political survivor, and a man who understood that military might alone could not hold the fracturing empire together. He needed glue. He needed a unifying ideology. And in the year 312, on the eve of the decisive battle of the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, he supposedly had a vision. He saw a cross of light in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign you will conquer." He had his men paint the Christian symbol on their shields, and he won a spectacular victory. From that moment on, Constantine became the patron of Christianity. Historians have debated for centuries whether his conversion was a genuine spiritual awakening or a shrewd political calculation. The truth is, it was probably both, but what matters for our story is what he did next. Early Christians had a complicated relationship with the Sabbath. Many of them were ethnically Jewish, and they continued to observe the Saturday Sabbath out of tradition. But for them, the most important day was the first day of the week, Sunday. This was the Lord's Day, the day on which Jesus was said to have risen from the dead. So, for a time, you had this awkward situation where some communities were observing two special days: Saturday as a day of rest and Sunday as a day of worship and celebration. It was messy, and it lacked a clear, unified standard. Constantine saw an opportunity. In the year 321, he issued a now famous edict that would lay the foundation for the modern weekend. The law he passed is a masterpiece of political maneuvering. It reads, "On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. In the country, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue their pursuits, because it often happens that another day is not so suitable for grain sowing or for vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven should be lost." Let's break that down because the specific wording is brilliant. He doesn't call it the Christian day or the Lord's Day. He calls it the dies solis, the day of the sun. This was pure genius. Why? Because while he was courting the Christians, the single most popular and powerful pagan cult in the entire empire, especially among the army, was Sol Invictus, the cult of the unconquered sun. By making the day of the sun a mandatory day of rest, Constantine was throwing a bone to both sides at once. For the Christians, it was a huge victory. For the first time, their special day of worship was being recognized and enforced by the state. They finally had official protection. It was the moment they went from a persecuted minority to a favored religion. For the sun worshippers, it seemed like a perfectly natural decree. They already venerated the sun. Making its day a day of rest was an act of piety they could easily get behind. It allowed Constantine to present himself as a traditional Roman, honoring a powerful deity, even as he was fundamentally reshaping the religious landscape of the empire. And notice the pragmatic exception he carves out for farmers. This wasn't just about religion, it was about the economy. Constantine knew he couldn't just shut down the entire food supply of the Roman Empire one day a week. The grain had to be sown, the grapes had to be planted, so he made a practical concession. City dwellers, the merchants and bureaucrats, got the day off. The agricultural backbone of the empire kept working. It was a compromise that recognized both the needs of the soul and the needs of the stomach. With this single edict, Constantine achieved three things. First, he elevated Christianity to a privileged position, beginning its transformation into the dominant religion of the Western world. Second, he created a unifying, weekly holiday that could be embraced by both Christians and pagans, helping to smooth over the deep religious fractures in his empire. And third, he took the ancient Jewish idea of a weekly day of rest, detached it from its exclusively Jewish context, rebranded it, and institutionalized it across the known world. The 7-day week, with one day set aside for rest, was no longer the strange custom of a single tribe. It was now the official policy of the most powerful empire on earth. The Saturday Sabbath had lost the branding war to the new, state-sponsored Sunday. A new age was dawning, one where time itself would be dictated not by the sun or the seasons, but by a calendar sanctioned by both God and Caesar. But this brings us to a critical question about the man at the center of it all. You have Constantine, an emperor who clawed his way to power, presiding over a vast empire teetering on the brink of collapse, an empire of competing faiths and fractured loyalties. His decree creates the first empire-wide day of rest, the ancestor of our Sunday. But was it a genuine act of piety, a gift to the Christians whose faith he was adopting? Or was it a cold, calculated political move to unify the masses by rebranding a popular pagan holiday and neutering the exclusively Jewish nature of the Sabbath? A holy day born from faith, or a power play to control the calendar? I want to know what you think. Drop your honest opinion in the comments below. Alright, so Constantine has just dropped the biggest bombshell on the Roman schedule in centuries. Sunday, the day of the sun, is now the official day off. But this is just the beginning. The Roman Empire, for all its power, would eventually crumble. But the idea it helped launch, a week structured around a day of rest, would be picked up and carried forward by the single most powerful and enduring institution to emerge from Rome's ashes, the Catholic Church. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Europe descended into a period of fragmentation and chaos that we often, somewhat unfairly, call the Dark Ages. Kings and warlords fought over scraps of territory, but there was one entity whose authority crossed every border and touched every life: the Church. And more than any king or emperor, it was the Church that became the ultimate master of time. If you were a peasant living in France or England or Germany in, say, the year 1000, your life was governed by 2 clocks. The first was the great, slow clock of the seasons, the same one your ancestors had lived by for millennia. But superimposed over that was a new, more complex calendar, and it belonged entirely to the Church. The church bell in your local village was your whistle, your alarm clock, and your news bulletin all in one. It told you when to wake, when to pray, and when to stop work. The Church's control of time went far beyond just enforcing Sunday as a day of rest. It created a calendar that was a dense, intricate tapestry of sacred obligations. Our modern calendar is mostly empty space, punctuated by a few secular holidays. The medieval calendar was the opposite. It was a minefield of non-working days. First, you had the major feasts of the liturgical year. Christmas, of course, which often involved a 12-day break from work running all the way to Epiphany. Then there was Easter, the most important holiday of all, which was preceded by Lent and followed by another week-long celebration. There was Pentecost, or Whitsun, another week-long festival. These were the big ones, the universal, mandatory holidays for all of Christendom, but that was just the start. Layered on top of that were dozens upon dozens of saints' days. Every day of the year was dedicated to a particular saint, and many of these days were holy days of obligation, which meant you were forbidden from doing servile work. You had to attend Mass, and then you had the rest of the day off. Some of these were universal, like the feasts for the apostles, but many more were local. Your particular village might have a special devotion to St. Giles, your kingdom to St. George, your local guild to St. Joseph. Each of these came with its own mandatory day off. Add to this other random church-mandated rest days. There was a period called the Ember Days, 4 sets of 3 days that were set aside for fasting and prayer each season. There were local festivals celebrating the anniversary of a church's founding. And of course, there were the more personal events, the weddings, funerals, and baptisms that were central to village life and took precedence over plowing the fields. When you add it all up, it's astonishing. The modern historian Juliet Score, in her research on working hours, has estimated that the average medieval peasant in England or France in the 13th or 14th century had somewhere between 80 and 150 days off a year. That includes all the Sundays, the major feasts, and the plethora of saints' days. Let that sink in. A peasant, a serf, someone at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, likely had more vacation time than the average modern American office worker. Now we need to be careful here not to romanticize medieval life. It was, by any modern standard, brutal. Life was short. Disease was rampant. Famine was a constant threat. The work they did was backbreaking manual labor, done with crude tools under a relentless sun or in freezing rain. Their days off weren't spent jetting off to the Riviera. They were spent in a small, often squalid village, and a large part of the day was still dedicated to religious observance. But this reality completely shatters the popular image we have of the medieval peasant toiling ceaselessly from dawn to dusk, 365 days a year, covered in mud. That image is a caricature, largely invented by later writers during the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, who wanted to portray the past as a time of unrelenting misery from which they had progressed. The truth is, for all its hardships, the medieval world was one in which leisure, or at least a break from manual labor, was deeply woven into the fabric of society. It wasn't organized into a neat 2-day weekend, but it was there, scattered throughout the year like jewels in the calendar. It was a system that, for all its faults, recognized that humans were not machines and that life should consist of more than just work. There had to be time for God, for community, and for celebration. This rhythm of life, this balance between toil and rest dictated by the church, would dominate Europe for 1,000 years. And then, a German monk with a hammer and a list of grievances would bring it all crashing down. The next great dramatic conflict in the story of our free time begins in the early 16th century, and its protagonist is Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation, which he kicked off in 1517, was a theological earthquake that shattered the religious unity of Europe. But it was also a revolution in how people thought about work, time, and God. Luther and the other reformers who followed him, like John Calvin in Geneva, had a massive problem with the way the Catholic Church ran things. They saw the cult of saints as a form of idolatry, a distraction from the direct worship of God. They looked at the hundreds of holy days and saw not piety, but institutionalized laziness. They saw the feasting, drinking, and carnivalesque celebrations that often accompanied these holidays and saw not community bonding, but pagan debauchery. So they took a machete to the Catholic calendar. In the new Protestant lands of northern Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and England, the vast majority of saints' days were abolished. The liturgical calendar was stripped down to its bare essentials. For the most part, you had Sunday, and that was it. The goal was to purify the faith, to return it to its simpler origins. But an unintended consequence was that it radically increased the number of available work days in the year. The Reformation, in a very real sense, put Europe back to work. But the reformers didn't just change when people rested. They fundamentally changed how they were supposed to rest, and this is where the invention of boredom truly begins. This new, stricter approach became known as Sabbatarianism. The name is a giveaway. The idea, promoted most aggressively by the followers of John Calvin, the Puritans in England and America, was that Sunday should be treated with the same solemnity and rigor as the Jewish Sabbath described in the Old Testament. Remember the Catholic medieval Sunday. After you went to Mass in the morning, the day was yours. It was a day for socializing, for visiting family, for sports like archery or a primitive form of soccer, for dancing on the village green, for heading to the local alehouse. It was a day of community and recreation. The Puritans looked at this and were absolutely horrified. To them, this wasn't honoring the Lord's day. This was desecrating it. For a strict Sabbatarian, Sunday was to be dedicated exclusively to pious activities. That meant attending long church services, often both in the morning and the afternoon. It meant private prayer, reading the Bible, and catechizing your children. And most importantly, it meant abstaining from two things: all forms of work and all forms of fun. This was a revolutionary and, for many, deeply unwelcome change. King James I of England actually issued a book of sports in 1617, which explicitly listed the games and recreations, like dancing, archery, and leaping, that were permitted on Sundays after divine service. He did this because he was alarmed that the Puritan killjoys were making the new Protestant faith so unattractive that ordinary people might be tempted back to Catholicism. The Puritans, in response, were furious. They saw the King's Declaration as a license for sin. When they eventually took power during the English Civil War in the 1640s, they promptly had the Book of Sports publicly burned by the common hangman. Under Puritan influence, Sunday became a day of enforced quiet and solemnity. Any kind of recreation was seen as a profanation of the Sabbath. This wasn't just a social pressure, it was written into law. You could be fined or publicly whipped for playing games, drinking, or even going for a casual stroll on a Sunday. This new, grim version of the day of rest was a complete departure from the medieval tradition. Rest was no longer about communal celebration and rejuvenation. It was about private piety and the anxious salvation of your soul. The party was officially over. This austere, rigid interpretation of Sunday didn't stay in Europe. It boarded a ship called the Mayflower and set sail for the New World. When the Puritans and other dissenting Protestant groups established their colonies in North America, they brought their Sabbatarianism with them, and they wrote it into the very legal code of their new society. This is the origin of America's infamous Blue Laws. The term Blue Laws itself is shrouded in a bit of myth. The popular story is that they were printed on blue paper in the New Haven colony, but there's no real evidence for that. A more likely explanation is that the word blue in the 18th century was a synonym for rigid or moralistic. In the same way we might call someone a blue nose or a killjoy today. But whatever their name, their effect was undeniable. They sought to legally enforce the Puritan vision of a perfect Sunday. The sheer range and severity of these laws are almost unbelievable to the modern mind. In the 17th century New England colonies, you could be fined, put in the stocks, or whipped for a whole host of Sunday offenses. It was illegal to engage in any form of labor, which included not just your job, but things like cooking elaborate meals, sweeping the house, or making a bed. A ship's captain was famously arrested and put on trial for returning to Boston Harbor on a Sunday and kissing his wife on their own doorstep after being at sea for 3 years. The court deemed it an act of public lewdness unfit for the Lord's Day. Travel was severely restricted. In many places, you needed a special pass to travel more than a very short distance from your home on Sunday, and you had to have a good reason, like going to a different church or tending to a sick relative. There were laws against running, walking in your garden, or lingering in the streets. Playing any kind of sport or game was, of course, strictly forbidden. In Connecticut, a law from 1650 stated that whosoever shall profane the Lord's Day, or any part of it, by sinful servile work or by unlawful sport, recreation, or otherwise, would be punished. Even basic human joy was suspect. The Reverend Samuel Peters, in his somewhat sensationalized History of Connecticut from 1781, claimed that there was a law stating that no one shall make minced pies, dance, play cards, or play any instrument of music, except the drum, trumpet, and jew sharp. Most famously, he described a law that no woman shall kiss her child on the Sabbath or fasting day. While some of these might be exaggerations, they capture the spirit of the Blue Laws perfectly. The goal was to create a society where Sunday was a day of absolute, total, and joyless religious observance. These laws weren't just a 17th century quirk. They persisted in various forms for centuries. Well into the 19th and even 20th centuries, Many states had laws on the books that banned all sorts of commercial and recreational activities on Sunday. You couldn't go to a theater or a concert. Professional sports were illegal. And most famously, you couldn't buy alcohol. The lingering legacy of the Sunday closing laws for liquor stores in many parts of America is a direct echo of this Puritan past. So by the time we reach the eve of the Industrial Revolution, the idea of the weekend in the Western world, and particularly in America, is a complex and contradictory inheritance. We have the ancient Jewish concept of a sacred day of rest, a divine gift of freedom. We have the Roman and Christian institutionalization of Sunday as an official, empire-wide holiday. We have the medieval Catholic tradition of a day of community celebration and feasting. And now, we have the powerful, lingering influence of the Protestant, and especially Puritan, Sabbatarian tradition, a day of quiet, solemn, and legally enforced piety. The single day of rest, our Sunday, had survived for centuries, but it was a day freighted with immense historical and religious baggage. It wasn't yet part of a weekend. It stood alone, a solitary island of non-work in a 6-day sea of labor. And that island was about to be submerged by a tidal wave of smoke, steel, and a new kind of time, a time that didn't come from God, but from a machine. The factory whistle was about to blow, and it would nearly drown out the church bell forever. The fight for our time off was about to enter its most brutal and decisive phase. The world we've been exploring, a world of church bells, sacred calendars, and seasonal rhythms, is about to die a very sudden and violent death. The agent of its destruction is the Industrial Revolution, which begins in earnest in the late 18th century in Britain, and then explodes across Europe and America in the 19th. This isn't just a change in technology. It's a fundamental rewiring of human society, of the family, of the landscape, and most importantly for our story, of time itself. The great antagonist in the modern struggle for the weekend has arrived, and it takes the form of the factory. If the God of the old world was, well, God, whose calendar was managed by the church, the new God was the machine, and its high priest was the factory owner. Its temple was the mill, and its holy text was the ledger book. This new religion had only one commandment, thou shalt be productive, and it had one great enemy, wasted time. Picture the shift. The farmer's life was tied to the sun. He rose with it, he worked under it, and he stopped when it set. He worked hard during planting and harvest, but there were natural lulls, times in the dead of winter or the heat of midsummer when the rhythm of work slowed. Time was cyclical and organic. The factory was the opposite. The factory was a monster with an insatiable appetite. It did not care if it was sunny or raining, summer or winter. It cared only for inputs and outputs. And its most important input was human labor. The factory whistle was the new church bell, but it wasn't calling you to prayer. It was a shriek that sliced through the dawn, calling you to the loom or the lathe. It blew again to signal a brief, meager lunch break, and it blew a final time, late at night, to release you back into the darkness. For the first time in history, life for millions was dictated not by nature, but by the punch clock. Time was no longer a river. It was a resource to be divided, measured, and exploited down to the last second. The result was the near-total annihilation of leisure time. The old medieval calendar with its scattered holidays was a distant, laughable memory. In the pursuit of maximum profit, factory owners imposed a work schedule that was relentless and brutal. A 6-day work week became the standard. 16-hour days were common, especially in the early decades of the Revolution. And in many industries, particularly those with continuous processes like blast furnaces, the 7-day work week became the grim reality. Sunday, the one day of rest that had survived for over 1,000 years, was itself under assault. Many owners, resentful of the mandated shutdown, would force workers to come in on Sunday mornings for cleaning and maintenance, often without pay. The island of rest was shrinking into a tiny, precarious sandbar. To understand the stakes of the fight that was coming, we have to immerse ourselves in the reality of what this new world of work was like. It wasn't just the hours, it was the conditions. Let's step into a textile mill in Manchester, England in the 1830s. The first thing that hits you is the noise. It's not just loud, it's a physical assault. A deafening, continuous roar and clatter of hundreds of iron machines. A sound that never stops, that you feel in your bones, and that will leave you partially deaf within a few years. The air is next. It's thick and heavy with cotton dust, so dense it looks like a fog. You breathe it in with every gasp, and it coats your lungs, leading to the chronic, debilitating lung diseases known as brown lung. The temperature is stifling, often kept artificially high and humid to prevent the cotton threads from snapping. Sweat pours off you, but the windows are kept closed to maintain the atmosphere. Then you see the workers. You see women and children, prized for their nimble fingers, standing for 12, 14, 16 hours, performing the same repetitive task over and over. Children as young as 6 or 7 crawl barefoot under the moving machinery to scoop up fallen cotton scraps. A terrifying job where a moment's inattention could cost you a limb or your life. There are no safety guards on the gears and belts. Accidents are horrifically common. A hand crushed in a press, a scalp torn off when hair gets caught in a spinning shaft. There is no workers' compensation, no health insurance. If you get hurt, you're fired. If you get sick, you're replaced. You are a disposable part in a giant, relentless machine. And at the end of this grueling day, you walk home, not to a charming village, but to a crowded, unsanitary slum that has sprung up around the factory. Your home is a single room you might share with 1 or 2 other families, with no running water and a shared privy out back that overflows into the street. Sicknesses like cholera and typhoid rip through these neighborhoods with horrifying speed. This is the world that industrial capitalism built. It was a world of unprecedented production and wealth, but for the millions of people who fueled it, it was a waking nightmare, a life stripped of dignity, health, and most of all, time. The promise of progress looked a lot like slavery with extra steps. This brutal reality could not last. Out of the smoke and despair of the industrial crucible, a new kind of resistance began to form. It wasn't a theological debate or a royal edict. It was a raw, desperate fight for survival, waged by the workers themselves. This was the birth of the organized labor movement. The story of the fight for shorter hours is a war story, plain and simple. Its goals seem modest to us now. The first great rallying cry wasn't for a weekend, it was just for a sane workday. The slogan that electrified the movement throughout the 19th century was, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Think about that. They weren't demanding a life of leisure. They were fighting for the basic, radical idea that a worker's day should be split into 3 equal parts. 1 for their employer, 1 for sleep, and 1 for themselves. They were fighting for the right to have a life outside the factory walls, to be a father, a mother, a citizen, a human being. This fight was bitter, and it was bloody. Factory owners and the governments that supported them saw the labor movement as a mortal threat to the economic order. They viewed demands for shorter hours or better wages not as reasonable requests, but as a form of revolutionary theft. They fought back with everything they had. They hired private armies of Pinkerton detectives to intimidate workers and break strikes. They created blacklists, so a union organizer fired from one factory could never find work in another. They used local police, state militias, and even the federal army to crush protests. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, you had capital with its immense wealth, political influence, and control of the press. On the other, you had labor with its power of solidarity, the power to withhold its work and bring the machines to a grinding halt. The history of the 19th century is littered with the casualties of this war. In 1877, The Great Railroad Strike saw workers across the country walk off the job to protest wage cuts. It turned into a nationwide insurrection, with bloody clashes in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. Federal troops were called in, and more than 100 people were killed before the strike was broken. The most infamous event in the American fight for the 8-hour day was the Haymarket Affair. In May of 1886, labor organizations in Chicago, a hotbed of radical activism, called for a general strike in support of the 8-hour day. On May 3rd, police fired on a group of striking lumber workers, killing several. A protest rally was called for the next day in Haymarket Square. It was a peaceful gathering, and as it was winding down, a large contingent of police moved in to disperse the remaining crowd. Suddenly someone, to this day, no one knows who, threw a bomb into the police ranks. The police panicked and opened fire, shooting wildly into the crowd and at each other in the darkness. When the smoke cleared, 7 policemen and at least 4 workers were dead, with dozens more wounded. The backlash was immediate and savage. A wave of anti-labor hysteria swept the country. 8 of Chicago's most prominent anarchist and labor leaders were arrested and put on trial, not for throwing the bomb. There was no evidence linking any of them to it, but for their political ideas, which the prosecution argued had incited the unknown bomber. The trial was a farce. 4 were hanged, 1 committed suicide in his cell. The Haymarket Affair became a watershed moment. For the business establishment, it proved that the labor movement was a violent, foreign-inspired conspiracy. For workers around the world, the Haymarket martyrs became heroes, and May Day, May 1st, was established as International Workers' Day to commemorate the struggle for the 8-hour day. The fight was long and brutal, but slowly, painstakingly, the 8-hour movement began to win. But even as they fought for a shorter workday, a parallel, more informal kind of resistance was creating the blueprint for the modern weekend. It wasn't won through organized strikes or political agitation. It was a grassroots, cultural tradition, a weekly act of collective rebellion known as Saint Monday. The tradition of Saint Monday seems to have started with skilled artisans in Britain in the 18th century, and it spread quickly with industrialization. The logic was simple. The 6-day work week was grueling. Sunday was, for many, a day of heavy drinking. It was often the only day for socializing, and the local pub was the center of that social world. The result was that on Monday morning, a significant portion of the workforce was either too drunk, too hungover, or simply too exhausted and demoralized to show up to the factory. So they didn't. They informally declared Monday a holiday. They canonized it Saint Monday. It became a day to recover from Sunday's excesses, to spend time with family, to tend to a personal garden, to go fishing, or to participate in popular, and often rowdy, sports like cockfighting or bull baiting. It was a self-awarded extension of the weekend, a thumb in the eye of the factory owner and the tyranny of the clock. This wasn't a small, isolated phenomenon. It was a massive, widespread cultural practice. In many trades and cities, it was simply assumed that no real work would get done on a Monday. Employers hated it. It drove them absolutely insane. It was unpredictable. It was inefficient. It threw their entire production schedule into chaos. They tried everything to stamp it out. They imposed fines for absenteeism. They tried locking workers out on Tuesday if they missed Monday, but the tradition was remarkably resilient. Workers clung to their Saint Monday. It was a piece of their week that they had claimed for themselves, and they would not give it up easily. Benjamin Franklin, ever the apostle of industriousness, complained about the practice when he was working as a printer in London in the 1720s, noting how his colleagues would rarely work on Mondays, and often not on Tuesdays either, instead spending their money at the pub. For him, it was a sign of poor discipline, but for the workers, it was a lifeline. It was a way of carving out a space for humanity in an inhuman system. It was, in effect, a worker-created 2-day weekend. They had their traditional Sunday for God and family, and they had their Saint Monday for themselves. The problem, of course, was that this weekend was chaotic and unreliable. It was a source of constant friction between workers and employers. It was a symptom of a broken system. The establishment couldn't crush Saint Monday, and the workers couldn't get it officially recognized. The situation was a stalemate. A new solution was needed. And that solution would come not from a labor radical or a benevolent politician, but from the most unlikely of sources. A ruthless, efficiency-obsessed industrialist who saw in the problem of Saint Monday not a headache, but an opportunity. The man who would perfect the factory system was about to give the factory worker a 2-day weekend, and he wouldn't do it out of kindness. He would do it because it was good for business. This brings us to the core of the struggle in the industrial age. The workers, ground down by a system that treated them as fuel, were fighting back. They were engaged in a desperate, often violent battle for control over their own time, for the simple dignity of a life not entirely consumed by labor. Their methods, strikes, protests, riots were radical and disruptive. They were challenging the very foundations of the new industrial order. So, were these tactics a necessary evil, the only way to force a change against an oppressive and violent system that held all the power? Or did the riots, the sabotage, and the bloodshed ultimately undermine their moral authority and slow down the progress they were fighting for by terrifying the middle class and inviting ever harsher crackdowns from the state? A righteous battle or a dangerous rebellion? I'm genuinely curious to hear what you guys think. Let me know your thoughts on this down below. All right, we have arrived at the final act. The stage is set. We have a 1,000-year-old tradition of a single day of rest on Sunday. We have a workforce that has been pushed to the breaking point by the brutal logic of industrial capitalism. And we have a grassroots, chaotic, worker-led rebellion in the form of Saint Monday. The entire system is locked in a tense, inefficient stalemate. The world is waiting for a resolution. And that resolution will come from a man who was, himself, a bundle of contradictions: Henry Ford. To understand why Henry Ford, of all people, becomes the accidental hero of our story, you have to understand who he was. Ford was not a simple man. He was a farm boy from Michigan who grew up hating farm work. He was a mechanical genius, a self-taught engineer who tinkered in sheds until he built a car that would change the world. He was a populist visionary who believed in high wages and mass production, a man who wanted to build a car cheap enough for his own workers to buy. He was, in many ways, the American dream personified. But there was a much darker side to Henry Ford. He was an autocrat, a tyrant who ruled his industrial empire with an iron fist. He hated unions, viewing them as a parasitic threat to his control. He was a notorious and virulent anti-Semite who purchased his own newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and used it to publish vile, hateful propaganda, including the infamous forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He was a man obsessed with control, not just over his factories, but over the private lives of his workers. He was a brilliant, innovative, and deeply flawed man, and his motivations were never, ever simple. He wasn't a humanitarian. He was a prophet of productivity. Everything he did, every revolutionary idea he had, was ultimately aimed at one goal: making the Ford Motor Company the most efficient and profitable manufacturing enterprise on the face of the earth. His first world-changing move, the one that set the stage for the 5-day week, came in 1914. On January 5th, the Ford Motor Company made an announcement that sent a shockwave across the industrial world. They were more than doubling the pay for their male factory workers, from an average of $2.34 a day to a flat $5 a day. This was the legendary $5 day. The reaction was pandemonium. The next morning, 10,000 desperate men swarmed the gates of the Ford plant in Highland Park, Michigan, begging for jobs. Riots broke out. The police had to use fire hoses to disperse the crowd in the freezing January cold. From the outside, it looked like an act of incredible, almost saintly benevolence. The Wall Street Journal called it a blazing indiscretion. Competing industrialists were furious, accusing Ford of being a socialist and of single-handedly destroying the labor market. But as always with Ford, there was a catch. The $5 wage was not a right, it was a bonus. And you only qualified for it if you lived your life the way Henry Ford wanted you to. To enforce this, he created one of the most dystopian corporate departments in American history, the Ford Sociological Department. This was, for all intents and purposes, Ford's private police force. A team of 150 investigators was hired to go out and visit the homes of every single one of his thousands of employees. They carried checklists and conducted intrusive interviews, not just with the worker, but with his wife and family. They were checking to see if you were living a proper life according to Henry Ford's rigid, puritanical standards. Was your house clean? Were you saving money in a bank account? Were you sober? Did you gamble? Was your wife a good homemaker? Did your children attend school? Were you a recent immigrant who was making an effort to learn English and Americanize? If you failed the inspection, you were put on probation. If you didn't improve, you were disqualified from the $5 wage and put back on the old, lower rate. If you still didn't conform, you were fired. This was Taylorism, the gospel of scientific management, taken to its terrifying extreme. Ford wasn't just managing his workers on the factory floor, he was engineering their entire lives. He believed that a worker who lived a clean, sober, stable life would be a more reliable, more productive cog in his industrial machine. The $5 day wasn't an act of charity. It was an investment in a more docile and efficient workforce. It was a golden leash, and it revealed Ford's core philosophy: total control leads to total efficiency. This same cold, calculating logic is what would lead him, a decade later, to invent the modern weekend. By the early 1920s, Ford was the undisputed king of the automotive world. His Model T had put America on wheels. His assembly line, a symphony of perfectly synchronized, repetitive tasks, was the pinnacle of industrial efficiency. But he still had a problem. He had tamed his workers' home lives, but he hadn't fully tamed their schedules. Like all industrialists, he was plagued by the high rates of absenteeism and the lost productivity caused by the unofficial holiday of St. Monday. His workers, despite their high pay, were still burning out, still showing up hungover or not at all on Monday mornings. The 6-day, 48-hour week was grinding them down, leading to high turnover and sloppy work at the end of a long week. Ford, the relentless pragmatist, looked at the numbers. He looked at the inefficiency, and he came to a conclusion that was both stunningly simple and completely revolutionary. On May 1st, 1926, he announced that the Ford Motor Company would be moving to a 5-day work week. His factories would shut down completely on Saturday and Sunday. Initially, he cut his workers' pay, since they were working one less day. But a few months later, he went all the way, announcing a 5-day, 40-hour week with no reduction in their daily wage. His workers would earn the same amount of money for working 5 days as they had for working 6. The world was shocked all over again. Competing industrialists thought he was insane. Labor leaders were suspicious, wondering what the catch was this time. But Ford calmly laid out his ice-cold business logic, and in doing so, he provided the final, crucial arguments that would solidify the weekend in the modern mind. First and foremost, Ford's decision was arguably the most brilliant marketing strategy of the 20th century. He wasn't just building cars, he was building a car-centric society. And he had a profound insight. A worker who is at the factory 6 days a week has no time to use the products he's making. What good is owning a Model T if you have nowhere to go and no time to go there? By giving his workers a full 2-day weekend, Ford was creating a new class of consumers for his own product. A man with a Saturday off is a man who might decide to take his family on a picnic, a fishing trip, or a drive to visit relatives in the next town. And to do that, he would need a car. He would need to buy gasoline. He would stop at roadside diners. He would, in short, participate in the new consumer leisure economy that Ford himself was helping to invent. He wasn't giving them a gift of time. He was opening up a new market. He famously said, "Leisure is an indispensable ingredient in a growing consumer market because working people need to have enough free time to find uses for consumer products, including the motor car." It was a perfect, self-reinforcing loop. Second, the 5-day week was a direct assault on the problem of Saint Monday. Ford wasn't a fool. He knew his workers were exhausted and using Monday to recover. His calculation was brutally pragmatic. By giving them a full, official Saturday off, he was giving them a day to run errands, to do household chores, and yes, to recover from whatever they did on Saturday night. The result? They would show up on Monday morning sober, rested, and ready to give him a full, highly productive day's work. His own studies had shown him that the productivity losses from exhaustion and absenteeism on a 6-day schedule were so great that he could get the same amount of output, or even more, from his workers in 5 focused days than he could in 6 grueling ones. The 5-day week wasn't about working less. It was about getting more high-quality work done in the time you were on the clock. It was the ultimate expression of his obsession with efficiency. Third, the move was a masterstroke in the war for talent. Just as the $5 day had done a decade earlier, the 5-day week instantly made Ford the most desirable employer in America. While other companies were still running their men into the ground for 6 days a week, Ford was offering a schedule that gave a man a real life outside the factory. This meant he could attract the best, most skilled, most reliable, and most disciplined workers in the country. He could skim the cream of the labor crop, further boosting his factory's legendary productivity. It was also a preemptive strike against the unions he so despised. By voluntarily giving workers the shorter hours they had been fighting for, he robbed the union organizers of one of their most powerful recruitment tools. Why join a union and pay dues when Henry Ford was already giving you what you wanted? Ford's logic was inescapable, and soon, other businesses, however reluctantly, began to see the light. At first they resisted, but they couldn't compete. They were losing their best workers to Ford. Their own productivity was lagging. The idea of the 5-day, 40-hour week began to spread, industry by industry, not primarily as a victory for labor, but as the new gold standard of efficient, enlightened management. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place during the greatest economic catastrophe of the 20th century, the Great Depression. As unemployment soared to a terrifying 25%, the idea of a shorter work week gained a whole new rationale. It was no longer just about efficiency or leisure. It was about work sharing. The logic, promoted by both President Hoover and later President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was that if you cut the hours of existing workers, you could spread the remaining work among more people, helping to ease the mass unemployment crisis. This combination of the Fordist model of high-efficiency production and the Depression-era push for work sharing finally culminated in landmark federal legislation. In 1938, President Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act. This single piece of law cemented the modern American deal. It established a national minimum wage. It banned most forms of child labor. And critically for our story, it mandated that for most industries, the standard work week was to be 40 hours over 5 days. It didn't forbid longer hours, but it did require that any work done over 40 hours be paid at a premium rate of time and a half. This created a powerful financial disincentive for employers to run their staff for 6 or 7 days a week. And there it was. The 2-day weekend, born from a bizarre confluence of ancient religion, bloody labor wars, and the cold, hard calculus of a tyrannical industrialist, was now the law of the land. The 3,000-year war seemed to be over. Humanity had won. And so we come full circle, back to that feeling on a Friday afternoon. That glorious, sacred feeling of release is not a gift from nature. It's a historical artifact. It's a hard-won prize, paid for with the theological stubbornness of the ancient Hebrews, the political scheming of a Roman emperor, the blood of the Haymarket martyrs, and the cynical genius of Henry Ford. It is the product of a long and brutal negotiation between our need for sustenance and our desire for a life. But the story of our time is never truly over. The truce that was struck in the industrial age, the 40-hour compromise, held for the better part of a century. But look around us now. The factory whistle has been replaced by the glowing screen of a smartphone. The punch clock has been replaced by the always-on expectation of the digital age. The boundaries between the office and the home, between work time and our time, are blurring and dissolving once again. The gig economy, the remote work revolution, the constant barrage of emails and Slack notifications, these are the new battlefields in the ancient war for our time. We may have won the weekend, but the fight to keep it, and to define what it truly means to be at rest in the 21st century, is a war that is far from over. The enemy, the tyranny of endless work, never sleeps. And maybe neither should we. And that's where the story of the invention of the weekend comes to its dramatic close. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Beast History so you don't miss what's next. We've got so many more insane stories ready for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.